Right, this video is just going to cover the remaining section of the feasibility study. It's also going to just run through a completed M2 example in its entirety so that you can see the kind of standard and quality of the work that's expected in the different sections. So let's start off with the last section of the feasibility study. So in lesson we covered the predicted timeline and cost of the development. Okay, and you guys hopefully are aware of the system development lifecycle, the stages: analysis, design, construction, testing, and then the need to kind of outline the key activities that happen in each stage, the kinds of resources that will be needed, and then trying to, and this is the tricky part of this particular section, is just estimating some timescales and then some costs based on the resources and the amount of time you need them for. Okay, so that's where we got to, and that was the time plan and cost section done, which means the final section then is to do the market assessment in the feasibility and understand how you document the results and the conclusions from that. Okay, and at the end of the feasibility study, of course, the whole point of the feasibility study as a whole is to try and establish that this product idea would be a good one to move into design with and do some further work on, and maybe even develop, okay, without wasting huge amounts of money and time. So yeah, market assessment. So for this section, what you need to do is produce a questionnaire that targets potential customers to see if they're actually interested in your product idea. Okay, so it's to get some feedback from the actual market. Now, base the questions on the final proposal, so the one that your feasibility study has been focused on, so whatever that particular product is. You need to get at least 8 responses to the questionnaire. Okay, so hopefully you can make the questionnaire available through Teams for other students to fill in using a link, or friends and family. Usually a good place to go to get those responses. But either way, minimum of 8. If you can get more, fantastic. But 8's the minimum. With the people that you choose, by the way, do think about whether or not they sit within that target market that you've described as being the focus for your product as well. So that is a kind of criteria to try and meet as well. In terms of the questionnaire, there needs to be at least 10 questions. So you need to generate some relevant questions, and you need to think carefully, and we'll talk about this on the next slide, but you need to think carefully about what kind of information would it be useful to actually get from potential customers at this stage of a project. And yeah, that's one of the key requirements of this section, actually, is coming up with suitable, relevant questions. Obviously the questions need to be completed by the target market. I think I've previously spoke about that. The focus in a questionnaire, of course, because it is a tool used for gathering data, quantitative data from a large number of people usually, is that you're asking predominantly closed questions. So closed questions that have set responses, for example, yes, no, kind of responses. So where possible, try and limit your questions to closed questions. I would probably suggest that the final question in your questionnaire is an open question that maybe allows users the opportunity to provide a bit more qualitative data in terms of their opinion on the product, or any remaining thoughts that they have. Usually makes quite a good last question, and you can get some expansion and some detail about maybe why they've answered some of the questions the way they have. Okay, you can use a couple of open questions, but predominantly closed questions, and definitely have at least one open question. And I'd probably recommend, if you are going to use just one, that it goes at the end of the questionnaire. Okay, what kind of things are you looking to establish then? Well, one area could be the demographic, in terms of seeing if there's a correlation between the people's age, gender, maybe even ethnicity perhaps, that maybe affects the type of responses that you get. So certainly they could be potentially good questions to ask. Attitude towards the device we'll come to in a second. Do they like your idea? You could provide a kind of outline of what your product is, and see what the feedback is around that. How much would they pay for the device and the kind of functionality that might be needed within it? Let's expand on that on the next slide actually. So yeah, demographics, age, gender, who are the people who are actually filling in your questionnaire. It might be that you can spot some patterns and some trends as to how different genders or different age groups are responding to the questionnaire. I think this question here is a really good one to ask, and you might want to ask this in multiple ways, or you might want to have sort of like a tick all that apply section. So if you think about the main problem or set of problems that your product hopefully improves upon, you could maybe list those problems, and the question could be something along the lines of have you ever experienced or do you currently experience problems with, and then list a range of options X, Y, and Z. Relating to whatever the product area is and the problem, and that would be a good way of establishing that actually the problem that you think people have, they do actually have. Okay, so that would be definitely a good question there. Make sure, of course, you're making this specific to your product and the problems here. These are just generically worded. They could apply to any situation. So do think carefully about your questions and wording them in a way that is specific to your product. Do they like your proposal? You could ask that in different ways. What don't they like as well? That might give you some ideas for improvements. That could be an open question. Would they buy the product? I guess those two are kind of tied in. This one's quite an interesting question, thinking about maybe budgeting, and also obviously trying to predict in terms of price points later on down the line when it comes to selling the product, what kind of money consumers might be prepared to spend, and you could give some categories there, some ranges of prices that customers could select from. Okay, and obviously help you determine again whether or not it's a viable option based on that information you receive. This is quite a nice one as well. So I mean, you could almost sort of go back to your different proposals here. So when you've done your alternative proposals earlier on in feasibility, you've probably identified different features at certain points. Obviously you've kind of come to a decision as to your final product, but it might be worth just getting that double check to make sure that there weren't any features that you've got in some of the other alternative proposals that actually customers would like to see in the product. Okay, so again, you could easily turn that into a closed question with a list of features, and the customers could check the ones that they would like to see in the final version. Okay, other things to think about. Well, you're going to need to make sure that your customer base have the required technology to be able to access your device. So if your product requires the use of a smartphone or a desktop computer or a tablet, or it might be that you're looking to see how much technology different users have access, in which case you might give them the choice of a whole range of different technologies and see which platforms customers have most ready access to. So there could be a couple of questions like that. You might also ask it around the software environment, Android and Apple, and the different OS, Microsoft devices, etc., to get a flavour there perhaps around again whether your proposed idea sort of matches what your customers actually have access to. Obviously, every Internet of Everything product will need to be able to communicate data, and you're going to need to make sure again that your customers have the right equipment and the right connections to be able to do that. So are they going to need a 3 or 4G connection on their phone? Do they need a Wi-Fi internet connection at home, for example, to be able to upload data to the cloud? Are they using ASDL connections, or are they on fiber connections? Again, because if your device involves uploading large amounts of data, then customers probably aren't going to want to do it unless they've got a fiber optic unlimited upload limit on their internet connection. So questions around that could well be relevant as well. Okay, so I think they're probably the key areas. Of course, if you think of more questions that aren't as aren't the same as the ones that we've already discussed, then by all means put them in. I think the key thing is just make sure that when you're writing them, they're clear, they're concise, they're well written, there's no spelling mistakes or grammar issues, and the key thing here is context. Make sure they're specific to your product and the problems around your product, yeah, you might even include an introduction that just outlines the purpose of the questionnaire and also the idea of the product that you're looking to bring to market, and kind of provide a brief summary for customers so they know why they're completing it in. Okay, and remember, the overall purpose really is part of the feasibility study is getting some feedback on an idea from the actual market to see and help make a decision as to whether or not this idea is worth continuing in terms of development. Okay, so in terms of making the questionnaire, I recommend you use Google, either Google Drive, which has a survey creator, or if you go into Office 365, you'll find Microsoft Forms, which also has the ability for you to create surveys as well. That allows you to generate a link once you've created the survey and send it out to people, email, social media, etc., and hopefully you'll get your responses pretty quickly. Once you've got the results in, the final part of this then is actually to document the findings. So for every question, and this is the really useful thing about using Google or Microsoft, is that you can generate graphs automatically, which will show you the patterns and the trends in your data. So generate those graphs, and then what we need to do is copy each graph using maybe the snipping tool into your project, and then you need to provide a summary next to each graph, just kind of highlighting what the conclusion is in terms of what does the actual result show you about your audience or customer base, and yeah, what have you learned from asking them that question, basically. Okay, so a small summary next to each one. On the final thing, just have an overall conclusion. So once you've documented all your results for each question and you've done your small summaries, it's just then to have an overall summary as to what the most important things were that you found out through doing the questionnaire technique. Okay, and then we should be in a position where the feasibility is studied, and based on the time plan, the costs, and the market research, whether or not we should continue the development or not. Okay, that's the whole point of the feasibility study. This shows you kind of like a typical question. So typical question, there's the single graph with the responses, and then we have here the actual summary in terms of the analysis of the results. Okay, so that for each of the 10 questions that you've got in your questionnaire. Right, last thing I was just going to show you then was just a kind of run through of a completed feasibility study, which hopefully I've got here. So I'm just going to go right back to the start of it, so you can see the outline of it, and actually that's the alternative proposal. So I'll just skip over here. So here's where the feasibility starts. So first section, of course, is where you're doing your market research and investigating you know, what the current situation is, who the competitors are, and you know, kind of trying to show that there is a problem to be solved by your product. Okay, so that should be around about half a side. This one's obviously a really excellent example, so it's got lots of detail, but probably around about half a side is enough detail in terms of that. Then we've got the three proposals, where you try and put a different, you know, you show that you've kind of considered different ways of delivering your product and then thought about the pros and cons. So we've got proposal 2, proposal 3, etc. Okay, so 3 different project proposals. Then we've got the conclusion as to which proposal is going to be carried forward, so proposal 3, and the justification for that. Then the benefits, so highlighting the benefits of the product, and again that should be around about half a side in terms of detail, and you can do it as a bullet point list. You don't have to do it in as a table like this candidate has done. Okay. After that, we've then got a list of the actual technology and the actual resources that are needed in the product to make it work. So the different sensors, the different networking protocols that are going to be used, and the different services, etc., the software that's going to be needed. Okay. Then we've got the legal considerations, which we talked about, so the DPA and the Copyright Design and Patents Act. Then it's the time plan, and then the last section I'm just going to fit this in before the 15 minutes expires. We have the results of the questionnaires with some analysis after each question. Okay, so that is the completed feasibility study.